Okay, let's talk. So we've got this wrap-up session, and then for some reason there's closing remarks on the schedule. If there are any, they'll be very brief. So one administrative announcement, which is that the shuttle will be outside the circle on Downer at 5:45, heading back to the hotel. So Emily wanted me to make sure that folks who are heading back in that direction would know that that's the case. And otherwise, there aren't really any rules for this event. I guess the rules would be that maybe we'll sort of, I guess, ask if any of the plenaries want to address anything in particular. I already had raised something that I would like to address, and several people came up to me actually afterwards, said, oh, they wanted to talk about that too. So I guess I will just put this question out there as maybe just an initial place to start, and see if panelists want to say anything, and just open it up. I guess, do I need to like call on people? Otherwise, it'll be too much the mob, the unruly mob. Okay, I will call on people from the audience. The question that I wanted to, I mean, there are two things I noticed. One was the passenger pigeon. It's like, okay, enough already. I mean, it's just, I mean, the passenger pigeon is a horrible, horrible extinction, but it's like we need some other examples too. But I was really struck, I mean, by how many times the poor passenger pigeon came up. But the more serious question that I did raise, and I think it's really interesting, and I have speculations, I guess, but not answers, and I'm more interested in what other people have to say, is how predominant the arts have been, the creative arts have been, in addressing, making aware, communicating, mediating, pre-mediating, remediating climate change, Anthropocene discourse. We had a couple of papers talked a bit about nuclear winter and the earlier kind of concern about the nuclear holocaust, and I really don't think, from as far as I remember, not that there weren't artists who addressed that, but I don't think that the arts had the same kind of role, for example, in that issue. So I would like to at least start with, and then just to say that, as it turned out, 3 of the 6 plenaries were actually about art. I mean, 2 were explicitly reviews of art exhibits, and then Joanna's was about photography, art in a variety of ways. And I hope I'm not misremembering any of the others. If you want to claim, I guess Claire was talking about a film. But I think for half of the, and we didn't invite people to do that. We didn't, we just invited people to say, hey, you've been working on this, do something, and that's what people are we're interested in talking about as well. So I guess, yeah, I'd be interested in if we could start with that question. Anybody you want to say anything, or should we just throw it over?
Yeah, I thought that you should have invited the people who introduced the plenary speakers up here and have them tell us what we all did wrong.
I think the audience is capable of doing that.
Can I say something very brief just about the art? The interesting thing about the art is with regard to the notion of the Anthropocene that's come out many times here, and a lot of people have been saying how it's a problematic concept because it obviously distributes blame unequally, that it already overlooks too many things, that it's just too much of a blind spot. It's another category for theorists to kind of get off on, and then. But the interesting thing is that the different temporality of the Anthropocene that has been taken up by the artists, while the scientists are still deciding. And obviously, as we know, the Stratigraphy Committee will tell us in 2016 whether there is or there isn't an Anthropocene. By which time, it's very likely that in the art scene and within the kind of cultural theory community, the concept will have become extinct. Because we've done it to death. But so what's been interesting for me is the way how the artists and theorists have come on board with this concept and have approached it precisely not as a scientific concept, but as an artistic proposition. And the Haus der Kultur der Welt project in Berlin over the last 2 years, or the Serpentine Gallery, or many projects in the United States, both big and small, and in lots of other places, where the Anthropocene was kind of placed like, a cat amongst the pigeons, both dead and alive, that had to kind of think and try to come up with something. And I think the arts have provided also theorists and philosophers with a different modality. I think that was very visible in the conference. So rather than trying to determine the way Zalashevich and his crowd and stratigraphers are trying to do, the old men, by the way, but they'll tell us the truth in 2016. Artists and theorists borrowing from the methods of kind of visual arts and other arts have been trying to ask different questions. And that, for me, has been very interesting, both about the Anthropocene project and around the way we've approached extinction through that concept at this conference. So thank you to Richard and Emily, and thank you to all of us.
Yeah, I have, so I think there's a faith in contemporary art in many of the presentations as already given as a useful tool for addressing these problems. And I think that's foreclosed on a materialist kind of look at the institutionality of contemporary art, right? And that has in turn foreclosed on the question of whether contemporary art itself is part of the problem, right? How does contemporary art function in the world? And it's through corporate money, and it's through hedge fund money. And so I'm not sure we can decide yet whether contemporary art is a useful tool for this.
Can I make a comment about that? I think that's half right. I think that's a characterization of a certain type of contemporary art, but the artists I was talking about don't operate in that economy. They don't make art as a commodity, to sell for profit. They actually work mostly in universities, mostly off of grants that people like Ron Brolio or other people scare up through sustainability centers or whatever. And so it's a different kind of circuit, How that's from the circuit that like Jeff Koons would be the epitome of, right? How that's related to the aesthetics and formal characteristics of the art, which came up some in Claire's question to me, is an interesting and I think really complex question. I mean, I think the lines in a way are sharper in terms of the economies and institutions than they are between the aesthetics of some of this work and what those aesthetics take for granted or foreground or or whatever, right? So so I think, again, I would say I think you're absolutely right, about a certain kind of contemporary art, and I don't have a huge investment in that either way, and it's kind of not how I was dealing with the work that I was dealing with. But I think there are different circuits within people who make, especially research-based kind of contemporary art. So
yeah, but the ecosystem is subtended by corporate money mostly. I mean, even at the university level, I would say a great
You can say the
deal.
same about universities.
Sure.
Not just, even about public universities. Where do faculties, the retirement money, where does it come from? The kind of investments of universities. Of course, we can make the same arguments. I think it's a little bit of a cheap shot.
But that's a narrow definition
No, I don't
of
think
art
so.
too. I mean, there's gallery art, there's art that's done from universities, but there's also indigenous art, amateur art, and some of Nick's presentation had a bit of graffiti that struck me. That's art, and I think why that image was interesting in your talk is because that reason has played out. We've all got the facts about climate change, we've all got the facts. That cognition has played out. And that rationally you could say, well, this is how much resources we have. We can live until this point. I mean, I think I heard something in the news about a year ago. We shouldn't be panicking about climate change and resource depletion because we've got enough to last us for 80 years. So quit your whining. But even if that said 200 years, there's something mysterious about there'll be a time when we no longer are, and why should we care? You know, we can care about our children, we can care about our, I don't have children, you know, we can care about, but how can we care about people that are 300 years from now? And yet strangely that idea, and then I think, well, reason and cognition has played out, argumentation has played out, a certain type of rhetoric has played out, and you know, it's interesting that you said Jeff Koons, because that sort of art has played out. Jeff Koons doesn't believe in Jeff Koons. That's the whole point. You know, it's like, but someone who puts white supremacy on a statue. Now that's not argument. It's not cognition. It's not, but it's flair, isn't it? I mean, it has a certain placard quality that I think is art. You know, it's more provocative, and it's gonna. And the interesting thing, it's bound up with extinction. You know, someone's gonna erase it. Right? It's not the art that's gonna stick in a gallery, and that's part of its aesthetic. Is its
yeah. So Nick first, and then.
So I should speak to both of those points. I mean, yesterday while we were sitting here, the Guggenheim Museum was occupied, and it was occupied by a group of people, some of whom I know very well, who put a big banner on the floor that is to do with the building of a Guggenheim Museum in Abu Dhabi. And one of the interrelated sets of arguments about this is an argument about the workforce being appropriately paid, which is an argument that pertains in universities and the art world in general. There's an argument about the debt that the workers get into in order to go to Abu Dhabi. They have to pay a thing called the Khalifa, which is basically a bribe to an organizer in order to go to work for $270 a month. And then there's the argument about climate, because what they're doing is they're building a Frank Gehry museum which is made of metal in a 120-degree desert. So it's going to have to be air conditioned to the max just to even to open, let alone to maintain the Jeff Koons stuff that will undoubtedly go in there, right? At the same time as the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi buys work from the same galleries in New York that exhibit at Guggenheim, New York. So all of these things are true, right? Well, to Claire's point, I think there's a set of art practice which is about creating events, like the Guggenheim occupation yesterday, like Liberate Tate in London, who to try and disrupt the Tate Gallery, taking a very small amount of money from BP to put its logo on absolutely everything that Tate does. They'll do actions in the space of the Tate, where a woman had oil poured all over her in one of the most famous actions, right? They don't leave traces, but the photographic evidence and documentation is generated that then appears in presentations like this. To the aesthetics of this, I think that was the difference. It was like, I think most of us tend to present work in action, like being used, being in encounter with audience, where stuff's happening, like the security guards in the Guggenheim yesterday cut the banner in half. We're talking about non-preserving. It didn't even, it lasted about 20 seconds before they got the thing cut in half. But the way it's presented, most of the presentations here is that very beautiful minimalist aesthetic. I mean, nobody used a PowerPoint. Everybody used like TIFFs and full resolution photographs that they've had commissioned from the galleries to give the maximum resolution image, right? Which is nice for us sitting here. But it's not how you encounter it as a spectator. There's stuff going on, there's noise, there's things happening. So, I mean, I agree with Joanna. It was kind of odd as a visual culture person to come in and see so much art being used in such a reverential way. We've been to it most of the time. We're like, there's all these things are wrong with the art world, but now this is the way we enter the discourse through the back door. That's what Stuart Hall said when the Goldsmiths Visual Culture Program was set up. Said you've got to watch out. Whatever you'll try and do this thing of displacing art, and it'll find a way to get in through the back door. That's how it has.
As somebody who did talk about the passenger pigeon just at 2 o'clock, I want to pick up on that point you made at the beginning. I think there's still something to say about the passenger pigeon, but I do take your point. No, I know. I think it actually is quite important, to kind of a nice jumping off point. I think part of the reason that the passenger pigeon figures so prominently, I think there's wonderful, genuine, valid reasons for it. I think another reason, though, is it's very specifically American. And working at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, I mean, you've got the moa in New Zealand, you've got the baji in China, you've got the Tasmanian tiger. And there's a rich art and literature and representation around those species. But when you talk to book publishers, well, we need some North American examples. A book on de-extinction in the Asia Pacific won't necessarily find an audience. So I think I know you're partially jesting, but then I also think there's a really jumping off point here, particularly when you talk about de-extinction. So much of the debate, it's very hard to separate what is universalistic from what is very specifically Silicon Valley and a very American framing of this that has to draw on American concepts and presume that they're global. So that's kind of a general question, but do you see that being an area that might be worth investigating? How do you bring in these other species? You've got to do so much labor just to get your audience, in a sense, to even understand if they're just not familiar with it.
Yeah, Bernie, you want to go and then maybe people have responses?
Yeah, I wanted to also go back to the art question and actually tie in some of Daryl's work as well. One of the things that I'm interested in is how do we...
Sorry, maybe people in the audience should say who they are. Just
Yeah,
because
okay.
Because, I mean, you know the plenary, but yeah.
I'm Bernard Purley. I teach linguistic anthropology here at UWM. My area of specialty, if you want to call it that, is language endangerment and language revitalization in indigenous communities. And one of the things that strikes me about Daryl's work is the deliberate attempt at trying to counter the narrative of extinction, especially when it comes to languages. How do we reformulate this phenomenon in such a way that it empowers indigenous communities to revitalize their languages? But this also ties into the session on de-extinction. How do we change that rhetoric to reformulate the possibility of, introducing species, reintroducing species? But for me, the really key issue, and this goes back to the art, is that how do we create a space where these conversations can take place? And this is where I agree that your critique is partially true, but also I agree that your comment that no, there are other forms and representations. Now for me, my work really bridges what you're talking about and what Daryl actually does. And so I created with my colleagues here at UWM an installation piece that really celebrates 4 endangered indigenous languages: Menominee, Oneida, Maliseet, and Anishinaabe-Moin. And the installation is at the Indian Community School right here in Franklin, Wisconsin. And the children love the piece. Now, for me, the argument is that, is it about representation? And when we talk about art, it's always representational, or is it something else? And I think this is where, for me, the kind of experiential density of installation pieces really begins to change the conversation in a way that you can't challenge these abstract notions or these kinds of sound bites. And this is where Daryl's work becomes extremely important. It is experiential. And so everything that we're talking about, has that particular kind of component. And so for me, as a roundtable conversation, how do we move from the representational to that experiential in the kind of work that we're doing, and then disseminating that to larger audiences?
Anybody want to pick up on any of those comments?
I don't know why representational or experiential strike me as highly aesthetic notions. And I mean, it's true that you could have an installation event that's not representational, that's good, but then there's other forms of art that wouldn't even recognize themselves as art. I mean, art that you could say, well, a certain form of discussion has reached its limit, which is one where you're trying to persuade people, listen, if you keep doing this, such and such is going to go extinct, whether it's humans or pigeons or whatever, and you can know it and then just keep driving anyway. And one response to that is art in the gallery sense or in the installation sense, but then there'd be another which interests me is a form of art that is now being consecrated as art by, let's say, Western art dealers dealing with Australian Indigenous art. That's not really, it's like, okay, you want to buy this and put it on your wall, on you go. And then the marketing that goes around that wants it to be experiential. So if you're marketing this, tell me how this traces back to your genealogy and tell me how this is authentic. And of course, the only way it gets sold is if it's somehow this mystical object from another time and another culture, which of course it isn't, right? But people want the experience, right, of something that's not a Jeff Koons, that's from elsewhere. And I think in some ways, part of the problem is the concept of art. If we think, well, we're all doomed and there's nothing really we can say about that, so let's do stuff that's interesting. And that is where I think a lot of us are, but that has to be seen as problematic as well, insofar as art has been this sort of set-aside place of either experience. No one wants to represent this world. It's a horrible world to represent. I don't want to see pictures of it as it really is. I'd much rather see them, pixelated and distorted and have, waste dumps, represented as sites of beauty. But I think that's problematic. I mean, I don't have a clear idea of what would be other than that. But I think the concept of the experiential is perhaps a little too.
Also, just to add to this, I think the reason why, and obviously why this concept of art, and I'm understanding it absolutely in the way Nick described it, was precisely kind of re-entering the debates in cultural theory and philosophy through the back door and then serving as a kind of distiller. So, without dismissing, of course, the institutional critiques that you've raised, that you're absolutely right about. And obviously, as I was trying to show my talk of the selling of Bertinsky or Gursky and all these other beautiful images where, you can sell people the catastrophe or the Anthropocene and make them pay lots of money for it. But I think what's happening around, art re-entering through the back door is precisely providing cultural theorists, philosophers, anthropologists with a non-moralistic discourse for talking about those issues, where the certain positions are not yet entrenched, perhaps, so it's borrowing a certain sensibility. Of course, there are no guarantees that we won't immediately aestheticize, but there is a possibility of a kind of renewed discourse. And I think with kind of the cultural studies sensibility, which has been expanding for a number of decades, adding, numerous groups of excluded others, and we seem to have recoiled back on ourselves, and now we've embraced all of ourselves as humans, because we've already identified so many different categories of exclusion, so now we've re-embraced ourselves as humans. And there is a danger of doing the kind of critique of extinction and Anthropocene in a very moralistic way, where political and ethical work stops and gives way to kind of moralism and hysteria. So I think art is perhaps this kind of irritant, as Stuart Hall called it, and which allows for a different sensibility, a way of re-asking certain questions. That's interesting. But also it's probably a temporary irritant. I don't think art will save us from extinction.
Well, we don't have a word for art. But we do have a word for the passenger pigeon. Mimia. Just a couple of seeds of thought that I'll throw in. It may look like we're pushing back against the notion of extinction, and I think this is what I struggled with when I was first invited to come here, because in my mind, we were just trying to be whatever that be is in terms of mia, and drawing from a knowledge system that pre-exists a lot of the problems that we're discussing here today. So, and we're highly adaptable, otherwise we wouldn't be here today with all that my nation has gone through. And so we're survivors in that sense, and we're pretty damn good at it, to be honest with you. whether we're opening a casino or revitalizing our language, we're pretty darn creative. And I think that there's an energy in that we're trying to preserve. There's a couple of concepts that are really at the core of our philosophy, and they're not ones that we really talk about overtly, but they get embedded in how we teach and how we engage with each other. But the first one is that we don't control life. You know, we may be trying to do that, but the reality is that we don't control life. The second thing is that we're not responsible for life. We don't own it. It's not ours. And the basis for those ideas are tied to older stories, pre-contact stories that talk about a time when humans came to this place called Earth. The animals were already here. And through the help of Wisaka-Chakwa, our cultural hero, humans negotiated with the animals about how they would behave. And the components of that behavior, the way in which we were supposed to behave and are supposed to behave, are then embedded in the stories about what one does after they kill an animal, before they kill an animal, those sorts of things, because we know that life and death is all part of that chain. But it was all laid out, and I would say that it was sustainable. I mean, you look back at what was here when the big ships arrived, it was a populated continent. There were 300 different languages here, and there was respect for difference. And it'll never be that again, and we get that. And I can't sit here and say that as a person living in 2015 that I believe that Wisaka-Chakwa sat down and negotiated like this. I know I have my own feelings about old stories, but the value in those stories is the lessons, because we as humans need to be able to remember. We need to be able to look back and use that, what is known, because remember, we don't have that past, present, and future. We have what is known as what is unknown, to use that what is known in order to move forward. And I think that, and I would hope that the reason that I'm even here sitting at this table and was invited, which I'm very grateful for, is that there is wisdom in all people's knowledge systems, first of all, but as indigenous people, we suffer from being invisible. And either we're labeled as being archaic or outdated or traditionalist, and I can tell you I'm the farthest thing from a traditionalist. But I've seen a tremendous amount of wisdom in our language, and I've seen it bring stability to our people. And that notion of stability is something I think we haven't really talked about. We've talked a lot about the problems and how to think about them, but ultimately we're looking for some form of stability, whatever that may look like in the future. And so, although my people don't have the answer, I think we can add to the conversation. So, and I would say that that's true for other indigenous nations.
Yeah, so Ron, you had your hand, do you have something now? Or
That was way back on our, so
Yeah,
it
so-
circles around.
Kenan, and then in the back, somebody? Yeah.
This recent discussion points out to me the degree to which the very idea of extinction is based on a Darwinian, Linnaean idea of taxonomy and of purity, and these themes have come up in a number of the papers that I've seen, that the very idea of extinction depends on a kind of model of life which is very rooted in a kind of 19th century scientificism. And that what I've seen a lot of people pushing against or doing other things with is trying to come up with other models of what living might be that maybe exclude the very idea of extinction. It could be neo-Lamarckian, or it could be like Melinda Cooper's idea of life is constantly producing surplus, but those exclude extinction. And I take inspiration from the Miamian Project and from a Native American theorist named Gerald Viziner, who talks about survivance, which is somewhere, it's not mere survival, it's not just being there, it's a continuance of survival. It's what the Native American communities are, he says, which is continuing alongside and imbricated in our world. And that to me seems to be a concept which in some ways excludes the very idea of extinction. So I'm inspired to that.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't go to the Extinction panel, so if this is rehashed, just tell me too bad. For Carrie and maybe Daryl, since you brought up not being responsible for the animals, do you see a difference ethically or whatever tack you want to take between the extinction as conservation, like with the condors, and other programs that I've seen where they would kind of do like a breeding program to Frankenstein together, something that's kind of close, but in the end is really going to still be a new animal?
I think there's a big difference in the fantasies involved, but in principle, no, I'm actually not interested in that difference. And I'm not interested in the validity of de-extinction being tied to something like an original, quote-unquote, version of a form of life. You know, and I'm actually, I mean, you know, part of what I talk about in what is posthumanism is I also don't see why these kinds of questions that I'm raising are even necessarily, in principle, limited to carbon-based life forms. I've yet to hear an argument why that would be the case either. That doesn't mean that ontogenetic and phylogenetic forms of embodiment, in which time plays a constitutive role, aren't important. It just means there's no reason to automatically index that to a carbon-based substrate, as far as I can tell. So, so I'm actually not invested in that difference, even though I think that horse has already left the barn. You know, when you start raising these kinds of examples.
Yeah, before I got the bright idea to go into linguistics, I studied wildlife biology. And I clearly remember a conflict, a personal conflict with my culture there, especially when it came to radio collaring wolves and things like that. I saw it as playing with wildlife, and that somehow humans were assuming a responsibility over them. And, you know, if there's any management that's needed, it's humans that need to be managed. We're the species that really kind of, you know, really need some work. And the reason I say I was torn is because I also am aware of the amount of environmental destruction that's occurred. And so one of my first jobs was as the director of my tribe's environmental department. This would have been back in maybe 1998 or 99. And it was funded through EPA. And so, again, you have a larger institution that's dictating to tribes on some level how they're going to manage their lands. There's a lot of conflicts, a lot of cultural conflicts, and I'm still sorting a lot of those out. But I, too, am not stuck on anything. The notion of purism or authenticity are really problematic, and they're very problematic in my work. And so they're just not one of those things that exist for us. And so, but, you know, respecting what is, and there's nothing wrong with mending, and I think that's how we kind of look at, you know, the whole term of management implies control over, so I hate to use the term, you know, land management or resource management, but there's a difference between what we consider to be mending and trying to control, so I would leave it at that.
Let me just follow up just one more thing that's relevant to your question. It also depends on at which level you want to kind of pitch the problem. So, which is why the whole semantics of the species or of the person or even of the body is to me a much too blunt of an instrument to really make any headway on this. I don't know if you guys read the recent New Yorker article on fecal transplants. Really, really interesting, but I mean, one thing it does is brings into, I'm not sure sharp focus is the word, but it brings into focus that, you know, that what I would call these kind of organism-environment or system-environment relationships, you know, are scalar, and they obtain at different levels of the organism, you know, including the level at which we wouldn't exist as these molar representational creatures, you know, without the entire sort of gut flora, which is very complex and has its own ecology, so on and so forth. So to me, how that plays out in biopolitical terms is a really complicated question. But I think so much of the conversation, this goes back to my annoyance that I mentioned in my talk that Richard shares on other terrain. But a lot of my annoyance around the semantics around these questions is precisely that it tends to back into some kind of fairly traditional way of dealing with the constitutive unit of the problem is. And the only I actually think species is really valuable as a concept in thinking about extinction, not because species doesn't have all these problems, but because it forces you to zero in on how the organism-environment relationship is radically non-generic, right? And does not obtain the same way, even with regard to different bird species, right? So, for example, I asked somebody earlier, I was asking you actually if you'd seen Ben Novak's talk on YouTube about the passenger pigeon. I mean, something he makes clear is that the complicated part is how do these pigeons learn the stuff they need to learn about migratory routes, not coming back to the same place every year, so on and so forth. And he says, well, you know, passenger pigeons are a good candidate because a lot of these behaviors in passenger pigeons are hardwired. And that makes our job easier, right, to get them to do this in ways that wouldn't obtain with other animals. So for me, the value of looking at species is not that it's an appropriate level, it's actually a strategic value for forcing you to immediately deal with the really non-generic relationship of the organism and the environment that unfolds in real time, right? And so that's very different. I mean, the reason it's a follow-up is that's very different from taking that semantics, you know, seriously in a sort of philosophical or theoretical way. For me, it's a pragmatic and strategic usefulness for trying to think these problems.
And maybe I could add a little something to that too, because I was really struck by your statement in the plenary about the problem with the bluntness of the categories being, you know, inadequate to the contemporary moment. And it seems to me that one of the things that concepts like the Anthropocene has done is given us this incredible opportunity to have a conversation around a real set of complicated relationships. But the danger in the concept is also it offers the hope that there'll be a singular answer coming out of it. It'll come in 2016, it'll come from the geologists, and it will solve it. It'll have been like a 5-year, 6-year conversation, and we'll move on. And I think, you know, one of the things that's come out of the conversation, particularly today, which has just been marvelous, is this idea of actually proliferating the ways in which we could engage that concept and not allowing it to stabilize in a simple kind of master narrative of either about extinction or about planetary scale environmental change. I thought this idea of 1610, 1945 as a way of kind of staging a conversation is fantastic, the kind of work that one can do with it. And my fear actually is that as we come to the end of a couple of multi-year projects on the question of the Anthropocene, as the geologists make their technical judgment about stratigraphy, that a lot of the intensities and the interdisciplinarity of the conversations that we've been having, that opportunity slides away, and it becomes, you know, we lose actually the opportunity to proliferate and complexify the relationships, which I think is one of the values of what we've been up to today. So this question of life with a capital L being a problem, I mean, I really heard that in your talk and thought that was an important point to underscore right now. And for me, you know, the turn towards art is one way of doing it. I don't work on art. I work in lots of other genres. So for me, one of the moves for, you know, to complexify my own process was to think with some other genres, and I found it very helpful to do so.
Yeah, I want to come back to that version of it. Sorry, I'm going to throw it out and would actually be interested in some of our artists or art historians to weigh in here. But from, you know, in my initial thinking about why art has to do with the question of temporality and especially futures involved in Anthropocene extinction and so forth. That is to say, and the question and the need for speculation, because you know, what we do as historians or what we do as theorists or critics and so forth is generally take a field that is already more or less in existence and apply certain kinds of frameworks and tools of critical analysis to that, whether they be political, whether they be formal, whether they be cultural, all sorts of economic. We have all these frameworks we can provide. And those are really useful to, let's say 1945 or 1610, or, to wherever else the spike might be, or to analyze the problems of capital and so forth. But what seems to me to be wanted here, at least as I've been thinking about this, and this is where I would like to hear from others who are engaged in this project, is how do you get people to imagine something that doesn't exist, or some things, because I think what Daryl was saying, what Joe was saying about proliferation of multiple kinds of ways of doing this, this seems to be what art and all of this growth of art is about. That you go into a gallery, for example, like the Innovative exhibit, and there are how many? 8 different ways, theory, 9, imaginations of futures that people are being asked to inhabit. And that seems to me something that marks this project of analysis as different from, let's say, the project of analysis of colonialism or imperialism. In that colonialism and imperialism have long history. Now, they have futures as well. I mean, it's not that they're over, but that, we can, I think the projects are in some ways, at least I would suggest or speculate the projects in some way different. So Jennifer and then
I'm a contemporary art historian, so there it is. But my background is in performance, and I think that I've also been struck with the ways in which a particular kind of contemporary art practice, and I guess what I would say in response to a lot of the conversation in this roundtable about art is, I guess my annoyance, to follow the up here, is to just sort of think of even just contemporary art writ large. Because I think that what I've been noticing throughout a lot of the presentations is that there's a really specific kind of installation art practice, or one might say participatory art practice, or performance practice, that aligns itself with a very particular strand of contemporary art that is not, say, the Jeff Koons or even in Joanne's talk, the kinds of photographic images that you're looking at are very different than, as you were even saying, as documentary or representational practices. So I think a certain kind of contemporary art practice that I would say allied more with the participatory or the performative allow kinds of different ways of posing complex questions that might not get posed or just get posed in a different way, and that there seems to be a very interesting alighting of this kind of conversation that's happening in a very particular kind of, say, I guess, Western installation practice that might, I think sometimes even just coincidentally work right now with a lot of the questions that we've been bringing up in the last few days.
I might be able to speak to that, just so the chair doesn't think that I'm not going to say anything.
I've been really worried about it.
The kind of relation between performative or performance art and role performances and role experiments, I think that those two can speak back and forth to each other. And there is a kind of a tendency, since none of the role performances that you do in your church or your teaching or your consumption or your household activities, none of it accumulates to big things. That people undercut it, and I understand undercutting it, but it does work on the molecular register of being. And I think that with respect to the issues that we're talking about, that kind of cumulative work is quite important. And so I see kind of a connection back and forth between the brief experiences that I've had with performance art and role experimentations. And they're part of politics. They're not crucial, or they're not everything, but they are part of politics, I think. That's the last thing I'm saying.
And you want to tell us who you're?
So I'm Raywin Martin. I teach visual art at Antioch College in Ohio, and I also make art. And I would say this perhaps relates to role experimentation as well as what a few people have said in terms of the art world and contemporary art. I think one thing that artists do to create more space for speculation is to resist or refuse the idea that there is such a thing as the art world, or there is such a thing as contemporary art, because they lead to a more generic understanding of what visual communication, what experiential language is, or what are these forms that we work with, and so I would encourage you to think about that a little bit. But also I think there are artists working in a way that is independent of capital or independent of theory, and independent of I've lost what I was thinking earlier, but yeah, that's just where I was in my head in response to it.
Thank you. Someone in the back. Oh wait, sorry, Ashley, and then.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Ashley. Yeah, no worries. I'm Ashley Dawson. I teach postcolonial studies at City University of New York. So I'm in an English department. I do a kind of art. It's not visual art, it's narrative. And so I think it's also important to think about narrative, because it seems to me that when we think about visual art, we sort of assume that this is about making present some dire goal towards which we're going, making it sort of tactilely and effectively present, and that progressive change is going to result from that. But if you look at narrative, in most cases, what we see when we look at after extinction is zombie apocalypse or something like that. It's essentially, we get these scenarios after extinction which are about the white male settler colonial narrative being recycled. And that's very true here in the United States. And people just get pounded with that all the time when they get exposed to popular culture and narrative. So while we might have some of these quite progressive, visual art representations, I think the vast majority of after extinction narratives are actually really, really scary. And they sort of feed into a kind of catastrophism which the right uses very effectively, although environmentalists still sort of assume that what we need to do is wake people up through, broadcasting the apocalypse. I know some of the panels have dealt with that, but I just wanted to sort of put that forward and see if anybody has any responses to that as something that we really need to deal with ideologically in contemporary society.
Well, in History Channel Life After People, the program precisely kind of rehashes that narrative, the zombies, but there's still kind of humans in a very particular guise of all these scientific experts, the old male experts returning and telling us what's going to happen when we all die. There's this kind of sublime pleasure in the wallowing in this kind of ruin porn, which is basically that repeated image of not just the Twin Towers, but all the other great buildings, mainly North American buildings, because that's clearly the audience, but also a few others from the world, and that we are supposed to see how the great world. And that's the kind of very teleological narrative, even though it is on the loop.
Actually, I just add one thing, because I thought that was a marvelous comment. I really appreciate it. And it has to do also with the politicization of existential danger as just a criteria for the political. And the colonial settler comment is really well taken. And I guess the lesson that I would take from the nuclear history of the United States is just exactly how politicized existential danger can become. And part of my interest in the paper was considering how there's an invitation now to do that with climate change, and to basically use it as a similar mobilizing strategy that has all those problems inherent in it. So my call for a kind of proliferation of imaging and of response is to maintain the intensity of the issues, but not have it locked into one singular ideological program, which I think is, the success of the nuclear state was that it was able to run a global military project for 60, 70 years that, even with the intense anti-nuclear resistance to it, was much on its own terms.
With there's also, because there's no unanimity about what that future is going to be. That's why the proliferation of possible future scenarios is so crucial, because with the nuclear winter narrative, people basically bought it. So there was a kind of one, pretty widely accepted sense of what that would look like. Yeah.
So first, a comment picking up on the last comment.
There you are.
I'm sorry, I'm Les Daldo. I'm an anthropologist, adjunct lecturer at the University of Chicago.
Thanks.
Very quick on the last comment in the life after people. If the interesting thing about that is, if only it were so easy that there were this rapture event, right? But there are so many aspects of the infrastructure now, like nuclear facilities, that require constant supervision to not become catastrophic and melt down, right? So we've kind of wired the place to blow, and if we were suddenly removed, we'd probably have a lot of global catastrophe, right? But my question was about, it seems that a lot of the anxieties and concerns in the conference have to do with unit of analysis, if I can put it that way, and sort of what the different stakes are for different units of analysis, and particularly with species, which has done a lot of good as a category, right? But as a unit of analysis, it's sort of blind to the units of analysis that the members of that category might prefer, whether it's people that are part of this sort of different group, or whether it's animals and species of animals. And not just, species versus individual, but the other sort of configurations of living beings that those creatures might prefer, like pods of whales or that sort of thing. And so when you think about like the whale, it's kind of the fun of subspecies of the Derridian idea of l'animaux as this sort of category that radically homogenizes. It happens on the species level too, and the last thing in the world that I would want to be is part of that kind of category, like the human, because then I'm just a token of a type, and no one really cares about me, right? It's about perpetuating that type, which is pretty scary for the individual. But there's also at the same time, I'll wrap up really quickly, the danger of individualism on the other end, which we know a lot about. Like Jeff McMahon, author Jeff McMahon, animal rights theorist, had an article for the New York Times philosophy blog Stone a few years ago, where he entertained seriously the question of whether we should, as humans, as managers, seek to eliminate predators from the world because prey animals die gruesome deaths every day, and nature is full of cruelty and red and tooth and claw, and should we seriously consider it our moral duty to stop this from happening, right? So there's a danger, too, in this radical individualism. But I would just kind of ask the panel what their thoughts are of sort of the problem of categories and the problem of thinking in these different units of analysis, and if they've thought about sort of better ways versus less ideal ways.
Well, one of the categories that was discussed in a panel today on capitalism and labor is capital. And it seems to me that a lot of academics have been kind of caught into a neoliberal or a Marxist mode, and it seemed to me that panel was trying to rework that understanding, even to pluralize notions of capitalism. I find that really valuable, very useful. And especially in relation to the circumstances that we now face. So yeah, I would put capitalism on that list as with species and I guess whales.
I just actually wanted briefly to come back to the question of art.
Tell everyone whom you are.
Sorry, I teach here. My name is Kumkum Sangari. I teach here at Department of English. I was actually, I've been working on feminist art in India for a while, and looking specifically at now at how, which circulates around precisely some of these issues. Mm-hmm. And some of this is public art, which means that it's not for profit. Installations can seldom be sold. Very few galleries will buy very few installations. So it's not really, that highly commodified, but equally the address of this art can often be, quite transnational and as well as circulate inside India. And what is sort of really striking to me is that they don't fold back into an Anglo-Eurocentrist notion of the human, nor do they fold back into West European philosophical traditions. So somewhere the question I want to raise here is that maybe we want to think about within art practice, specifically I'm talking about feminist art practice here, which is concerned with very similar questions, is can there be understandings of the Anthropocene which actually do not immediately fall back into particular notions of the human, either as arising from or as contesting very specific West European traditions? Because what happens then is that it's precisely these, it's precisely this vocabulary which is then used to interpret that art, and just any art. So it actually, the question about art is as much a question about our vocabularies and what we fold, what are actually very rich potentials in very diverse art practices back into the same language, or at least the same sort of set of family languages.
Nice small question. I mean, one way into that, I think, is, I would ask, and I've actually written a paper asking, well, who's this public of public art? And why should we think that the public of public art includes only people who know, who understand the various tropes and conventions and so on of art? And why should we assume that they're human beings? And I'll tell you what brought this to my head was I used to live a couple blocks from the Menil Museum in Houston, and they had some big monumental kind of Tony Smith, quintessential minimalist Tony Smith pieces in back, outdoors. And during the lunch hour, the Hispanic guys who do landscaping in the neighborhood were using one of the pieces as a backdrop to play soccer against. They were using it as a goal. And then all the neighborhood dogs who live in the apartment buildings nearby would come over and pee all over the sculptures. I mean, it was a real communication center for all the dogs who live in the neighborhood. So my question is, well, who's the public of public art here? Is it only people who get Tony Smith, and who circulate in a certain domain of cultural capital? Or maybe there's a more robust sense of the heterogeneity of what happens in this space where these hunks of black metal are standing, right? And this is connected, I think, to something I wanted to say earlier about what I like about art, why I find it useful as a kind of non-propositional mode of conceptualization, is that artists, in my experience, artists are much more sensitive than people who just work with words to the relationship between the bodily sensorium and how space and smell and light and other things are experienced, and proximity of other bodies, how those things are experienced in relation to choices they make about working with specific media. So they understand the relationship between medium and kind of embodied experience and perception in ways that enables them to do things that I can't do, that I learn from, right? So those two different questions, I think, actually are quite related, and I think they're finally kind of metaphilosophically related to the questions that I've heard Claire raise a few times recently in some of her papers, which is about who's this we that extinction or climate change or the Anthropocene is a catastrophe for, right? We had conversations about these questions back in the 70s and 80s around deep ecology and biocentrism, really long and serious questions about who's the we that we're talking about here and whose survival we're talking about here. So I think these are all parts of, to characterize or paraphrase what you were saying, the kind of radical denaturalization and not taking for granted of what these practices index and how they get folded back in or not.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with the fact that artists have, precisely at hand a different, paraphernalia from academics. But perhaps what I'm trying to say here is that, and public art has always been a multi-use space. I mean, but it's also been a communication space which actually sets itself up against the gallery, and against the white cube models and so on and so forth. So,
Sometimes.
yeah, well, maybe the kind of public art that I'm actually, really here talking about. So what I'm actually, and I wouldn't agree with you that this is non-propositional art. It's deeply propositional. It's deeply conceptual. It's often deeply researched as well.
Oh, well, that's why I call it non-propositional conceptualization, yeah.
Yeah, but it's still making propositions.
Yeah,
So,
fair enough.
so yeah, I wouldn't put it there. But simply, what I want to say is that should the different propositions being made by installation art and other kinds of performative art practice, actually, should they ask for the creation of actually other kinds of vocabularies from the ones that we are prone to use?
Yes.
Gloria, you had your hand up earlier.
Oh, yes. I got absorbed in that. Let me see if I can, let me see if I can formulate some kind of a question here. I mean, Carrie mentioned poo and the microbiome, so I feel I should say something. And I'd like to come back to this topic of species. One thing that I'm interested in, and that kind of comes up here and there, I wonder if the panelists might speak to, is one thing I'm interested in is how things like fecal transplants, or these threats of extinction, or these various things like climate change or catastrophic global biological events, if you think, and if so, how different kinds of species lines might be drawn. So one thing that I've been noticing in my own work is a kind of cross-species kinship that's drawn through, let's say, microbial lines. So the ways that certain microbes affect certain populations of plants and humans and animals as a kind of different kind of way of cutting through the concept of species. So that I'm wondering if any of this comes up in your work, and if so, how. In my interest, I see this being done somewhat problematically, but I wonder if you might have anything to say about that. Cross-species kinship.
Or anybody.
Or anyone else.
Want to respond? No one wants to talk about poo. Yeah.
No.
Natalie.
I'm not going to talk about food.
No, that's fine.
But I suppose what I'm asking for, I'm an artist in the exhibition curated by these guys, facing the golden spike landscapes of the Anthropocene. And it's wonderful to hear this very idea that maybe art is an intellectual venue and resource. And I can tell you that the impoverished language used by art critics or people who specifically write about art, absolutely, specifically basically speechless to be able to deal with the scientific, technical, complex socio-ecological terms that artists dealing and exploring with the Anthropocene are doing. But I suppose the trope that I'm most interested in hearing language and being in discussion with is this question of agency. Who is an agent? What agency do we have in the Anthropocene? And how does one experiment with that, right? And so in the material practices and the installations and the public spaces, I would call them, I actually would avoid using the term art, public art, and all the cultural authority that posits, and ask, could we call them experiments? That experiment with possibilities that allow the experience and reimagining, and call upon, see this as the zone where, the space race of the 21st century, reimagining and redesigning our relationship to natural systems is not going to be done, we don't want it to be done by the material scientists doing their stupid accounting or whatever it is that it, could we actually seize art as a kind of an intellectual venue to play out ideas and to experiment And the great thing about, that I would argue, for material public installations is that they do have a lingua franca of the materiality, right? That having an opinion on it is actually being there and being able to say, yeah, this works, doesn't work for me, doesn't, you know, that kind of, I don't know anything about art, but I know whether this is working and who it's working for. So dispensing with art language to a certain extent and asking if we can use it as an experimental zone to explore what is politically, socially, and ecologically possible now, here, with our limited resources.
So you know, if you want to...
One sentence on food. You want to go back to that. On feces. I wonder if the fecal transplant, while kind of recognizing the dynamic systems and entanglements, is still reinscribing allopathic biomedical assumptions which are really durable, which by saying, find the thing, cut it out, and transplant it somewhere else. So there's still that kind of atomism that's going on, and these systems are very durable.
Just very briefly I'm wondering to what extent this conference and the broader debate around extinction and the Anthropocene will allow us to develop a non-narcissistic discourse around care, and to return to, you know, Richard's opening comments on the first day around the defense of the public university, which is threatened in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom, and the kind of things that we humans in this particular kind of geopolitical location care about. So how do we kind of work through the problems of extinction and the problems of the Anthropocene and develop a kind of non-narcissistic politics of care for the things and institutions and relationships that are dear to us, while also trying to kind of think beyond species narcissism? Is it at all possible, or are the very humanities and social sciences premised on a certain idea of species narcissism? So that kind of goes back to your foundational concepts, not just the species, but the species invested in their own, not just survival, but a certain idea of self-love,
That's where, it seems to me that's where extinction can be a good motif. That you know, like you could do it as a thought experiment. Imagine we're all wiped away tomorrow, and someone else looks at the last days of the humans, right? And were we asking the right questions? You know, were we holding on thinking, if we just geoengineer our way, we could maybe hang on for 50 years, or will we do something that's really cool? You know, like create something, as opposed to, I'm not going to leave here without a fight, as opposed to, it's over, so let's now do something, finally do something that makes all the other horribleness worthwhile, or at least interesting.
Just a quick response to your question. I presented on de-extinction, and there was another whole panel on it. So, you know, there are these genetic technologies which are being developed to deal with the problem of de-extinction, but they're pretty much not regulated at all. And the last wave of genetic stuff was regulated, you know, basically all the big pharmaceutical corporations and other groups got their own sort of ethicists on the payroll, so that scientists basically don't have to actually think about these issues. It's just all sort of, you know, hived off in that kind of professionalized, completely corporatized realm. So I would say that it's really, really important to escape the narcissism of humanity, which is looking at sort of, you know, uploading itself through a really kind of dangerous posthumanism, creating itself as, you know, completely immortal, to be involved in these kinds of issues because they have incredibly real world stakes that, you know, again, kind of recycle a lot of colonial and imperial relations.
I think we're at time, and plus it's that moment when you're teaching and you look at your class and you can see that, yeah, people are pretty much ready. It's been a long day. It's been a long couple and a half days. And yeah, we're the only thing standing between you and the drink. So, in closing, let me just say again, great thanks to all of you for, you know, making this event what it is. Been a great set of conversations, and they'll continue, I think, to reverberate and proliferate in the future. And I want to again just do a shout out to the center staff. Only it looks like Emily Clark, of whom is here.
They're all working on it.
Oh, they're all. I say that they won't know that they did a shout out to them. Yeah, they're all doing their hard work, getting everything done, and of making everything happen. I mean, these events, these conferences over the last several years have gone remarkably smoothly, and that's because we have an incredibly talented staff. So that's really about all I want to say. Thank you all, and God bless.